libération de prisonniers, ce qui montre qu'effectivement, il y a quand même des problèmes. Et je crois que c'est important qu'on puisse les examiner aujourd'hui grâce à vous. So I would like to welcome you as speakers for this press meeting about Ethiopia. I think Ethiopia is quite in the news now with Prime Minister announcements last week and a lot of events and also tragic events. And so I would thank you for coming here. Before to give you the floor, I would like to offer just our last magazine. You can also find, if you wish, a copy in the entrance. And I also would like to ask you to sign our golden book. Just a signature here. You can just put below. And would also thank Mrs. Leila Bon, who organized this meeting with us. And so now, please, I let you the floor, and after we will start with questions and so on. So who will start, Mr.?
You will start.
Okay, please. You just push the button.
Okay, just from here?
Yeah,
okay.
The button just...
All right, very well.
Exactly.
Well, thank you for having us here. I'm glad to be here. Ethiopia always brings its problems to Geneva. The last time that the state was faced with a crisis, that is to say, an existential crisis, a deposed emperor came to Geneva. And not pretending that we are emperors over here, bringing our country's problem to Geneva, but as was mentioned, that Ethiopia now faces an existential problem, in my view, deeply rooted in its history. And that is what we want to talk about. I will be talking about what the problem is, what the multidimensional crisis that the country finds itself in. And afterwards, we also talk about possible solutions to avert crisis, to avert state collapse, which is a real possibility today than any time in the past. Ethiopia has had its problems at many times, but not as severe as it is today, not deep as it is today. That's what I will like to do in my turn, that I would explain my take on why Ethiopia finds itself in a conundrum, in a very deep conundrum, that it cannot extract itself out of. But there are still ways, and that the solution part, I will talk about the problem, that multidimensional problem, what causes it. As I said, it's deeply rooted in history, so I would like to connect it to the history, but mostly talk about the major problems in the country that are now threatened its existence. And my friend Jawar Mohammed will talk about the possibilities for averting a violent transition, which has always, transition is inevitable, change is inevitable, change is going to come whether we like it or not. The forces that allow for change are not human. They are social, political, and economic forces. It's going to happen. What we do is to try to channel that change to make it a positive change. So what we want to talk about is the possibilities for a transition, a peaceful democratic transition to the kind of country that all Ethiopians want to have. So start with my look back to history. In the last 100 years, of Ethiopia's history, three successive regimes: the imperial, which lasted from 41 to 74, the military, which lasted from 74 to 1991, and the incumbent, all have tried to build a stable entity, a stable polity, a stable state that can secure its borders, provide core services to its population, and gain the consent of the ruled for its legitimacy. All three have failed. And this is not my conclusion. As an acute observer of Ethiopian politics, a political scientist named John Mercaga said At the end of, and I'm quoting here, he says, at the end of the first decade of the 21st century, the incumbent regime in Addis Ababa is engaging in the same battles that had exhausted its predecessors, impoverished the country, and blasted people's hopes for peace, democracy, and escape from dire poverty. Surprisingly, the same conclusion that an academic also reached is now reached by the Ethiopian government itself. In a document that was released about a month ago by the National Security Council of Ethiopia, and the party's executive committee have reached the same conclusion that Ethiopia now faces the real possibility of regime collapse. So this is not my assessment, this is not a scholarship, this is not an academic matter, this is a real possibility. In my view, the challenges that led to the collapse of the previous two regimes remain unresolved in Ethiopia. And the problem is the problem or the failure of nation building in the country, which meant the nation building means in the country the creation of a national identity, an effective government, and a stable nation that is at peace with itself and with its neighbors. For an Ethiopian state to become a multinational, democratic state where citizens can live in peace and justice and in freedom, the country needs to overcome two major challenges that have roiled the politics and shaped the entity in the past half century. These are these two major questions that the country has faced for the last 50 or 60 years. These are the question of nationalities, or the question of national integration, and the second is the question of political transitions. Transitions in Ethiopia have always been violent, and that is what robs the people who are wishing for a stable government, a peaceful society, that transitions are always occasioned with a violent result. This has been the case in the last 20th century. For much of the century, the center of politics had been dominated by a ruling class that hails from the northern part of the country and the people of the southern periphery. And when I say this, it's not really my conclusion. This is based on studies of the Ethiopian entity, polity, that this periphery remained unintegrated to the state system politically. And in some areas of the country, the subjugated people remained economically and culturally unintegrated to the state. That is to say, people at the center refuse to share power with the periphery. There is the highland periphery and there is the lowland periphery, but the problem, that intractable problem, one of the major problems that has shaped Ethiopian politics in the last 60 years is the refusal of the center to share power with the periphery. The second is, since the 19th century, political transition in Ethiopia have always been, as I just said, effected through extra-constitutional means. Violent transitions occur all the time, and violent transitions occur because incumbent rulers stay in power much longer than their mandate allows for. Once their mandate had expired, but they keep on staying in power. There are examples that I could share maybe in an question and answer session where these had occurred in the past 100 years. But like all incumbents, unwilling to relinquish power, they invariably ignore signs of popular discontent, and which eventually undoes them, which eventually leads to their overthrow. They simply ignore them. One of these great messages from the population of Ethiopia to the incumbent regime occurred in 2014, and it's still going on. It's known widely in international media as the Oromo protest or the Oromo uprising. The people that represent about 45 to 50% of the population, where the resources of the country come from, feel like that they do not participate in their national life, they do not have genuine representative in the government, that they are robbed of their rights to have their identity shaped by themselves, rule themselves, and have local control over their resources. This unprecedented nationwide protest, now widely known as protest, occurred with the people demanding respect for rights enshrined, and I just want to underscore this, rights enshrined in the Ethiopian constitution. Instead of responding to popular demands for change, the incumbent regime responded with unprecedented violence, killing thousands, incarcerating hundreds of thousands, and imposing a state of emergency to control society. The violence, unfortunately for the government, did not suppress the protests. 3 years after they started, they're still ongoing. This is unprecedented in the country's history. It's unprecedented in Africa. And by some measures, it's unprecedented that people could sustain protest for 3 years and there is no sign that it is abating. Only recently has the government acknowledged that these demands are constitutional, they are legal, they are based supported by international instruments of human rights, but they're not addressing them. But resolving the issue of the country requires addressing these two major challenges that I have talked about. These are the precondition to addressing all other problems. Problems of poverty, problems of inequity, but the political problem must be resolved. Those two, national integration of sharing everything at the center, but also self-rule at the local level. But to occasion that, what is important is that we have a peaceful democratic transition to a participatory democracy where people are equal and enjoy liberty, freedom, and dignity, human dignity and justice. Now, that probably is not a possibility now. And that's where I want to focus on the problem. The problem begins with the promise of a new political dispensation when the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, a coalition of 4 parties, the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, the Amara National Democratic Movement, the Oromo People's Democratic Organization, and the Southern Ethiopian People's Democratic Organization. 4 parties, known as the EPRDF, they came to power in 1991. The leaders attempted in 1991. This is the era of what is known as the third wave of democratization. This was the time that in the West people were talking about the end of history, that the rest of the world will now be democratic and the liberal economic policies would dominate and shape the history of the world. At that time, they had no choice but to at least speak the language of democracy and market economics. So when they came to power, they promised that they will resolve the problem of national integration through federalization, through a federal system, and the problem of violent transitions through democratization of politics. For the first time in the country's history, hope loomed large that democratization would transform subjects into citizens with voice in their government, and federalization would resolve the question of national integration, specifically by addressing the twinned problems of Ethiopian politics. That is, land ownership or resource ownership and the question of deciding ethnic identity. So these two problems were supposed to be resolved through democratization of politics and the federalization of state structure. Now, whether Ethiopia was in the Ethiopia's democratization process was formally set in motion with approval of a constitution in 1995. Whether Ethiopia was on the path to democratization and whether the federalization was in force, the test came in 2005 in an election that was fair by Ethiopian standards, but the results were rejected by the governing EPRDF party. So unwilling to concede significant loss of seats in parliament and the consequent loss of power through elections, the government nullified the elections and violently suppressed the ensuing protest of the people demanding their votes to be respected. So consequently, the hope for the peaceful transfer of power, the currently accepted sign of a successful democracy, failed to occur in 2005. Democratization was effectively derailed. And in the aftermath of the crackdown, the EPRDF envisaged that it could prevent popular grievances from developing into a national consciousness and a result in national resistance by doing three things. And this is what I really want to emphasize. By controlling the political space completely. Secondly, dominating the economic sphere completely and centralizing the governing institutions in a state or an entity that was supposed to be federal, where power should revolve to the states. So let me talk about these three things in order, and then I'll yield to my colleague here. So controlling the political space. After the 2005 elections, in 2006, Ethiopia's late Prime Minister, Meles Zenawi, made the EPRF's version of democratization public, declaring that its goal, the country's goal, was the creation of a dominant party democracy. A dominant party democracy. That variant of democracy, elections were allowed to be held, but to confirm the party in power. And I am not making it up. This is in a book. This is really codified and practiced. The proposition was predicated on the rationale that competitive elections that produce frequent change of power weren't suitable for the kind of sustainable economic growth that Ethiopia needed. So in practice, this meant that the EPRDF would remain in power until Ethiopia had achieved the status of what is known as the middle class economy in 2025. So declared in 2005, becoming the official goal of the state that elections will be held, but to confirm the party in power until Ethiopia had become a middle-class country. Now, to achieve this goal, the Prime Minister asserted that Ethiopia needed a developmental state, not necessarily a democratic state. And he articulated his theory of the developmental state, that development must precede democracy. And he put it as follows, and I'm going to quote this from his own, the Prime Minister's own writing about the importance of a developmental state to Ethiopia. Now here is what the Prime Minister put. Where the circumstances for a developmental state do not exist, the chances for a stable democracy to emerge are indeed remote. Where they exist, while there is no guarantee for democracy, there is a reasonable chance for a developmental and a democratic state to emerge. That is to say, this is a gamble, that it is better to grow out of poverty first and then talk about democracy later. But if you start with democracy, you will lose both, that you will not become democratic and you will not become developmental. So it's better to sequence it rather than having both at the same time. That is, achieve development and then democracy had a better chance of succeeding. So it's unambiguous. The implication was unambiguous. It implies that it is justifiable to be undemocratic in order to achieve development, because that the latter can increase a chance for democratization. So in effect, the developmental state became an ideology that undergirded the EPRDF's refusal to share power. Declared the official policy in 2006, measures were taken to put the ideology into practice. That came in 2008 when the EPRDF won 100% of the seats in the local and municipal parliaments. In 2010 national elections, the EPRDF won 99% of the seats in the national parliament. In 2015 national elections, it won 100% of the seats in parliament. This meant that there was really no place for opposition and hence for democracy. The ritual of authoritarian democracy or elections in which votes are cast but not counted became the symbol of Ethiopia's democratization without popular participation. That's controlling the political space, politically said. After winning large majorities in parliament, the ruling party passed laws that restricted the right to expression. It's called the Press Law of 2008. Then the right to association, it's called the Civil Society Law of 2009. And the right to assembly, it's called the Anti-Terrorism Law of 2009. Constitutional courts were emasculated. They were turned to instruments of suppression, of dissent, and persecution of political opponents. constitutionally protected human rights were henceforth violated with impunity. The promise of the rule of law was substituted by the practice of rule by law. Rather than the rule of law, rule by law became the standard practice in Ethiopia. So control the political space and then pass laws that actually gives you more control. Now, in addition to concentrating power in the hands of the single party, the Ethiopian version of a developmental state also envisioned a society that cannot deviate from the official line of the state-sanctioned public discourse. In the same book that I just talked about, the architect of the developmental state ideology, the late Prime Minister, put it in such an Orwellian manner that when revolutionary democracy, that is the ideology of developmental state, when revolutionary democracy, and I'm quoting here, permeates the entire society, and I really want you to listen to this one. When revolutionary democracy permeates the entire society, individuals will start to think alike. And all persons will cease having their own independent outlook. In this order, individual thinking becomes simply part of the collective thinking because the individual will be in a position to reflect on concepts that have not been prescribed by the revolutionary democracy. That is, there is an official ideology and everybody must conform to it. Individual thinking is not acceptable. It will be a collective thinking, a party thinking. So, control the political space, control the legal space, and control the mind of the people to think independently. If I were making this up, you would probably doubt it. But I'm quoting it from his book, an unpublished book. So that is the controlling political space means. That is, the opposition would be dubbed undemocratic or anti-democratic and anti-development, and that's what happened. And silenced by law, the people were denied a voice and a voice in their government and the government of their own choice. The political space was effectively controlled. Now, once the political space was captured, that is, the state was captured, it was used to corner the marketplace, to make for the TPLF dominance of the economic realm. Dominance was achieved through several means. And I really don't want to spend much time on this, but maybe there is a written piece on this one. That they created party businesses, which I call parbus. Party businesses, that the four parties actually have businesses, conglomerates. And the military business, which are called milibus. And the oligarchs, individuals that actually have big businesses. Oligbus. So three types of mega conglomerates that dominate the economic space. That the EPRDF currently owns businesses that's worth almost a fifth of the country's GDP. If one adds up the net worth of the four mega businesses the party owns. Now, in the party businesses, the main actor in the party-owned businesses, the TPLF's endowment fund for rehabilitation of Tigray. It's called EFFORT. Numbers are hard to obtain for EFFORT, but it's estimated to own 66 companies worth $3 billion, and that are involved in all sectors of the economy, ranging from agriculture to manufacturing to transportation to banking and all service industry, that they are involved in all kinds of businesses. The second one is, the second set of businesses are the military businesses, and this is really known as the METEC, that is the corporation that the government created. It's known as the Metal and Engineering Corporation, or METEC. Officially a vehicle for technology transfer to the country, METEC is involved practically in all sectors of the economy: manufacturing, construction, energy, transportation, and other banking and other services. And as such, the military has become an economically powerful actor, mandated to manufacture and supply weapons to the country's defense forces. METEC produces armored vehicles, explosives, ammunitions, big guns, light weapons, personal weapons. The only thing that it doesn't produce is fighter aircrafts. So this is a military. but the military also is an active player in the economy. The oligarchs, and I just want to say something about this, that there are many, but one example that I gave you, the oligarchs, the interesting thing about this oligarchs is that the government rules through the party structure, not the formal state structure. But the party itself is controlled by oligarchs who were partly in government, were in government but retired, but these are really the shakers and movers who actually shape policy. But they play a very significant role in the economy as well. One example of this is Sheikh Mohammed Ali Alamudi, who is now in prison in Saudi Arabia itself. He owns a Midrock business conglomerate, which has investments worth about $2 billion in 2015. They are also involved in sectors of the economy, including mining, energy, manufacturing, construction, banking. So the overall effect of these businesses has been the stifling of the private sector. EPRDF itself has been a market supplanting party that has denied private entrepreneurs access to the most lucrative sectors of business. And you can imagine from that what this means in terms of corruption. That is, corruption, this is not the garden variety corruption, but this is where you capture the state and use the state itself to own businesses and to accrue businesses to these party conglomerates. All right, the final one is, now I've said about the controlling the political space completely and then controlling or cornering the market in the economy. And the third one is which really subverted the promise of the federal system. That is the single most important resource in Ethiopia that the state could offer up for investors is land. And according to the country's constitution, land is the vital resource owned by the state. And ideologically, state ownership of land is consistent with the party's belief that it is the protector of rural owner-operators against wealthy capitalists. In practice, this is the policy. In practice, or the constitution. In practice, land was to be administered by the regional governments in accordance with the federal arrangement, the federal structure of governing, where power is shared between the regional federal units and the central governments. In its eagerness to give investors unfettered access to agricultural lands, the EPRD government found it necessary to pass laws that made sure that the federal government retained control of land and control of the ultimate authority to decide who gets land. That way, laws were altered both at the federal level and at the regional state levels in order to make sure that the developmental state succeeds. The developmental state was meant to be a situation where the central planning works, which requires centralization. Federalism requires the devolution of power to the regional states, but because the goal of the country was not democracy or federalism, but the development or economic growth, that it was imperative for the federal government that was pursuing the ideology of a developmental state to gain control over the main resource that the country has, land. That is what really subverted the federal system and passed the control of land to the federal system. In a way, what precipitated the widely known, this massive protest that had now lasted for 3 years, is the issue of land. It started around Addis Ababa, when Addis Ababa had what is known as the master plan to extend its control over 1.1 million hectares of land, extending about 100 miles radius. A city would be expanding uncontrollably into the Oromia region. That is where the protest started. But in general, the protests that lasted for 3 years. These are protests against the control of political space, the monopoly over political space, the monopoly over the economic space, and the monopoly or the violation of the federal structure. Now, in the last official statement of the ruling party, it appears that the incumbent is caught between the will to do everything to retain this power, to retain or to survive, and the unyielding demand of democratic change from below. it seems determined, that is, the central government seems determined to use force to regain control. But more force, more violence will inevitably unleash more violence from the people. Failure to use force spells the end of the last weapon that is left to the regime. So the stubbornness of its leaders only makes for another violent transition, which we wanted to avoid. Let's see if we can avoid that.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for having us here. I thought the weather would be colder, but it's warmer. Probably we had good luck. I will be brief. I will first recap, the overall crisis Ethiopia faces today. Then I will go into what I believe would be a solution moving forward. When we talk about crisis today in Ethiopia, it's quite acute. It's okay.
Just push the button. Thanks.
Okay.
Better for you.
It's facing a very acute crisis in all dimensions. Politically, it is facing crisis from within the government and outside the government. Outside, the population has become ungovernable. The legitimacy of the government and also the ability to impose fear that helps dictators survive is no longer there. Particularly in two largest regions, in Oromia and Amhara regions, the population do not trust the government. They do not fear the government. They do not believe they are actually part of the system. And when we go to inside the government, the party itself admits that it has no unity. It has no leadership. There is a prime minister, but anybody who follows Ethiopian politics today will tell you the guy has no power, has no control. It's a mess. As Gail was speaking earlier, they ruled that country for 27 years through a coalition of 4 parties. For most of those years, they were able to impose a centralized control over the country and over the party. The party used to speak in one voice. Now the party doesn't speak in one voice. The party has split between those who want to embrace reform and change and those who want to keep the old track of controlling the system. So the political crisis has created a security crisis. We are talking about a country where 2 regional states, 2 provinces of the country, have engaged in open war. The Somali and the Oromia regional states have engaged in open war that has resulted in deaths of thousands of people and displacement of almost 1 million people. This is a federal government where 2 federal entities, as if they are 2 foreign or neighboring countries, have engaged in a war. The state security apparatus is no longer in tandem. They are no longer working together. The state security or the provincial security and the federal security have engaged in a number of times in open clashes where people have died. So the possibility of the security apparatus, the military itself disintegrating is quite serious. More dangerous is also the economy. Ethiopia, although most people probably did not benefit, Ethiopia had an impressive economic growth over the last 10-15 years, but now that growth has been halted because the protests over the last 3 years have resulted in a reduced trade volume and a reduced foreign direct investment. As a result, right now, the economy is in shambles. The government started a number of mega projects, and financing those projects have become really difficult. And the foreign currency shortage is as acute as any other problem. So when you combine the political, the economic, and the security crisis, the thing we propose here, the people in a lot of Ethiopians' mind today, they fear that the state, not only the regime, the state could itself disintegrate is quite real. The government is not in control and is not also willing to move on a path to reform. I propose an approach that probably will avert not only the collapse but also open towards democratic transition. A two-way or a multi-track dialogue is needed. The first is internal dialogue. The second is external. Internal within the ruling party, within the existing regime. External with the opposition. Internally, as I said earlier, the party is no longer one. The party is now 4 different parties, even multiple factions competing. So instead of trying to reimpose the democratic centralism approach, they need to liberalize the political discourse within the party itself. Most importantly, they need to let the state structures function. The constitution is quite beautiful, but they need to let the constitution work. That means the legislative, the parliament need to be allowed to debate policies, debate laws. And we have seen over the last couple of weeks, when they're given opportunity or when they push back and fight, they can actually produce the kind of solution that's needed. They need to let the parliament debate. For example, Ezekiel talked about the multiple repressive laws. The parliament should be discussing and debating and repealing those laws. And also, Ethiopia is a federal state. But the power has been extremely concentrated in the hand of the federal authorities. They need to let the federal states exercise the kind of autonomy granted to them by the constitution. The judiciary, the judiciary has a number of competent judges, but interference from the security branch prevents judges from undertaking their oaths. So the judiciary should be allowed to undertake its job. If you allow this kind of internal political liberalization, you need to simultaneously also allow external dialogue. Ethiopia has pretty much no opposition right now because almost all significant opposition leaders are in jail or exiled. And what they need to do is they need to open up dialogue and negotiation on the rule of the game, on how to transition to an open democracy with the opposition. Of course, to do that, you have to first release them. And the announcement by the Prime Minister and the ruling party about a week ago to release the political leaders and political prisoners is actually a good one. And it is welcomed by most of Ethiopians. However, it has to be done quickly, and it has to be done unconditionally, and it's also the minute they are released, their movement within the country, their ability to organize their members to function properly, to open their offices need to be allowed, and both public and behind-the-scene negotiation has to happen with these opposition leaders in order to allow democratic transition. So, to summarize, as we said earlier, both possibilities of state collapse as well as the transition to stable democracy is there. State collapse will happen if the regime, if the government is continue to resort to violence, resort to force to solve political crisis. As Gail earlier mentioned about this national security document, for first time it admits that the country is facing serious crisis, and the problem is mostly a problem of politics. But their prescription is not political solution. They want to resolve a political crisis through military solution, and that approach does not work. Their argument is we need first to stabilize the country so that there will be a stable condition for negotiation and dialogue. But the more violence you use, the more violence you will invite. The prospect for democratic transition is quite brighter today than probably 2 years ago or 3 years ago for multiple reasons. The opposition or the protest or the resistance, those who seek change, have remained non-violent, which is quite interesting. For most, in Africa and in a number of developing countries, when a state resorted to violence, a response from the youth often is to resort to violence as well. What we have seen with Oromo protests and other protests in Ethiopia is these young people who make up 70% of the population, who are unemployed and who are angry, have resisted the temptation to engage in violence. They have resisted the government's pressure to push them into the jungle, into picking up the gun. And instead, they have relied on a very sophisticated and a very promising nonviolent resistance. And of course, as multiple studies show, a nonviolent movement has a better chance of producing democracy than a violent or an armed struggle. But another important development that makes us hopeful about democratic transition is an emergence of a reformist elements within the ruling party itself. A number of individuals and also factions have openly called for opening the political space for multiple voices. Particularly in Oromia, the current governor and his team have liberalized the political space despite the heavy presence of the military. And having those kind of allies within the government will help those who seek democratic change to exert both external and internal pressure. Towards this, I think particularly the Western governments, the US and Europe, their interest in Ethiopia is very clear. They want Ethiopia to be stable and secure so that it can play a stabilizing role in the Horn of Africa region. Fine and well. If that is the case, their choice is very simple. If they support forces that seek transition to an open democracy, a democratic Ethiopia will be a stable Ethiopia. A stable Ethiopia could be a stabilizing force in the region. But if they continue to pump money and support politically in other ways a regime that chooses to continuously securitize and militarize the politics in the country, the possibility of state collapse could be real, and the collapse of the state and the regime and an increasingly violent confrontation could not only destabilize Ethiopia but also destabilize the region. We are hopeful. We will take questions now.
Okay. Thank you very much for this introduction. I think it was quite interesting. Maybe before to give the floor to the audience, I have two small questions as a non-specialist of Ethiopian affairs. So first remark, since now, these last years, Ethiopia has a pretty good image here in the Western countries because some economic growth and some stability and so on. So, as I can say, it's a false flag, it's a wrong image, you mean, or it was a real economic growth. How to reconcile this this image with the reality, or because here that's a little bit the impression we have, in the mainstream opinion in the Western European, or maybe also in America. So what is your opinion about that? And second question, is it a domestic problem or is it an imported problem? I don't know, with some ingerence or from other countries inside the Ethiopian politics, or not at all, because we can see in many countries some outside interference with inside politics. Is it the case or not at all? Second question. And yes, does for instance the Somalian collapse, is it a model, or is it totally different? Because we have also in mind here the case of Somalia, which the state has collapsed totally. It is a similar danger or not, just to maybe to better understand the picture. So I don't know who will answer, or maybe Professor and that. Please, yeah.
Well, thank you for the questions. The first one is, it's not really the question where there is a high rate of economic growth.
Yeah, okay.
That's not a problem.
For instance, we just announced here in Geneva the first air link between Geneva and Addis Abeba just today. So which is a sign of kind of good economic relation, I understand.
And a good public relations as well.
Probably.
Yeah. This problem of economic growth but persistent poverty is not a unique problem in Ethiopia. That is, what we see when we talk about economic growth, that is really economic growth, high rate of economic growth, registered and explained in terms of the GDP. That doesn't say how that wealth is distributed. And that's the point that I was making, yes. That whatever progress that was made in Ethiopia is not widely shared, and people cannot feel it. And that's not really an Ethiopian problem. It is a problem a world over. So there is economic activity. There is economic activity in Ethiopia. There is, as a result of that economic activity, there is growth. Growth is registered. Now, I personally doubt that the rate of growth is 10% or 11%. It's probably in the neighborhood of 7%. But regardless, if people who dominate that economic activity is the party businesses, the military and politics, and the oligarchs, well, you can see why people still protest. In fact, when there is growth and people are not sharing in that, it actually heightens the possibilities of uprising. So that is the GDP growth. There are some also developments going on in Ethiopia, not only economic growth, there is development. For instance, one example is universities. And that's what the government says. It touts that the number of universities have grown from 3 to 30 or 3 to 50. That may be true. That may be true. But as one eminent Ethiopian academic who had lived in the United States and worked in the United States and American universities, in fact, he's a winner of a prestigious award named Gabisa Ejeta. He was told while visiting one of the universities in Ethiopia, he said, just because you have enrolled students and erected buildings, it doesn't mean that you have universities. I am a university professor, and I was educated in Ethiopia, so I can tell you that, and everybody agrees that the standard of education, the standard of graduates, is not the same. That just because you carry a degree, it doesn't mean that you are an educated person. That extends actually into the ruling party. That getting a PhD, buying it up in the market in the United States, doesn't make you a PhD. That extends into the ruling party. So the issue of growth is not even an Ethiopian problem, but this question of how it's shared. The second question was about
domestic or imported or
right.
Somalian effect, if yes or not.
Yeah, the third one. Yeah. Now this is about, yes, everybody knows in the world that there had been protests in Ethiopia for the last 3 years. It has now come to international attention because it lasted so long. It's a violent one, not the protesters, but the government that knew only violence in dealing with protesters. That these protesters actually intruded in this Ethiopia rising narrative and Ethiopia democratizing narrative that they spoiled. So the way it dealt with was with violence in Ethiopia. But the other thing is that they externalized the origins of the protests. That is to say, the protests are not indigenous. People in the country have no problem. They are very happy that there is economic growth, there is democracy. They are instigated by outsiders. This narrative had been foisted on the international media for 3 years. It no longer is a problem because the government itself now has admitted that outsiders have nothing to do with the protests. They actually said, it's not outsiders. The fault is not even people protesting on the streets. It's us. Who said that? Not me. It's the government itself in its last party congress admitted that. They said, it's us. They said, we got it all wrong. So this is not a question for the international media anymore, since the Ethiopian government itself has admitted the cause for all of these protests are created by the party. Now, I disagree with them that it is only a party problem. No, it is an inherent human reaction to deprivation. Discontent usually produces an upsurge of resistance. So that's what it is. These are real problems. The one thing that I want to say in that respect is the issue that Jawar mentioned. That is, despite the violence, the unprecedented violence, the protesters have remained peaceful. And their demands have been constitutional, legal, and the demands have been saying, restore the Constitution. Let the Constitution function. Restore the federal arrangement. Let it function. These are also supported, the questions of equality, liberty, justice. These are all I mean, Geneva should be the place for international instruments of human rights. These are all supported by him. So it's not external. The third is about...
Somalia, what is... with the Somalian collapse,
is that the same? I think there are different dynamics. What led to the collapse in Somalia is not the same forces working in Ethiopia, but the fact that Ethiopia is in that area, and it's not only Somalia. Southern Sudan is not a functional state. Sudan is not a functional state. In that neighborhood, Ethiopia is supposed to be the anchor, the island of stability that is holding the place in some form of stability. But it is in a real danger of collapse. Who said that? The government itself. That there is an existential threat. If Ethiopia does collapse now, because there is really no alternative, it collapses, there is nothing to take over. In that situation, the reverberation of collapse, state collapse or regime collapse in Ethiopia would be felt throughout the Horn of Africa.
On the image building, I think what was happening was this war on terror, with the instability in the area, Sudan and Somalia, and some in the West desperately needed at least one stable country. Yeah. And there was, I think, a fear from the Clinton era onward that if they push too much towards liberalization, two things could happen. One, Ethiopia could completely fold itself into China, or if we force it to open up, if they, for example, support the opposition, it could turn to instability could issue in the country. Therefore, they really propped up the whole idea of Ethiopia rising, but that created a problem in Ethiopia. What it did is it misled the government itself. The government itself felt that I can repress as much as I want, I can implement any kind of policy that discriminates against people, still my Western financiers will continue to support me. And they turned a blind eye to a simmering issue. The good example is Obama went there in summer of 2015. He called it a democratic country, and imagine a liberal man like Obama saying that. And 3 months later, this protest starts. That both the Ethiopian government worked really hard to paint its image positively in the West, but they had powerful allies, people like Bill Gates, professors from universities, these liberal professors who carry a heavy weight with the media, were able to help them. And having a man like Mullah, absolutely, and having somebody like Mullah Zenawi, a very smart guy, it helped. But when he dies, and when the political crisis erupts, that image starts to crumble. Another problem, you mentioned about Ethiopian Airlines. Yes, it's one of the finest airlines in Africa, but it masks the reality inside. The airlines' management is filled by a single ethnic group, and people in the country who for a long time actually prided themselves with that airlines start to say, oh, this is no longer an Ethiopian Airlines, but an airlines of certain ethnic group. You know how ethnic stripes starts. The other question you raised, is this domestic or external? There are times when the Ethiopian opposition received support from outside. That's in the 1980s. The movement right now is 100% non-violent. Therefore, it doesn't need anything from outside. They don't need guns, they don't need training, so they don't need anything from outside. These are young people, men, women, doctors, lawyers, who are doing their job and engaging in a number of non-violent protests that weaken the government. And for the first 3 years, the government was saying Eritrea, Egypt, and so on and so on. But now they admitted, in this security document, they said, you know what, the truth is, outside forces have nothing to do with it, and they are admitting. And as somebody who follows this movement closely, I can attest that the movement really doesn't have any support from outside, and it doesn't need that support because its cost is just quite low. The Somalia type, probably the Yugoslavia type. When you combine a federal state with authoritarian system, the federal entities, the blocks, kind of go separately. So right now, with this conflict, for example, between Somali region and Oromia region, you see what could happen if the center actually collapses. If the center continues to lose legitimacy and lose grip over the country, and if it doesn't initiate transition and a dialogue, a reconciliation, that what happened in Yugoslavia after the death of Tito, or what happened in Soviet Union, is the kind of stuff that could happen in Ethiopia. Probably worse, because it's the Soviet Union and Russia are surrounded by other countries. These are surrounded by countries that are already in trouble. That is a likely one possibility, but that's not the only possibility in Ethiopia. There is also a possibility of Ethiopia actually moving towards a democratic federal state. If with the support of a non-violent movement that is refusing to engage in violence, with emergence of reformist elements within the government, if rapid measures are taken to open up the dialogue and open up the space, the possibility for democratic transition is also there.
Okay, thanks for this precision. Thanks. So I open the floor to, yes, please. Some question. Here you push the button, please. Just front of the...
Okay, thank you. Thank you for organizing this panel. I hope you'll, the press club, I hope you'll continue with that track. And I thank also the panelists for their brilliant expose and much more focusing on real politics than history of Ethiopia, which is pegged on 100 years. And you've told us that the country is ruled by 4 ethnic parties. So, unlike Switzerland here, the states, the federal states, are also delineated on ethnic basis or linguistic basis. Now, in my view, this will hinder the movement of labor and sorry, it hinders. I mean, it prohibits labor and capital. So we can see that the dominant party in Ethiopia taking a lion's share. For example, in Tigray region, we have a lot of industries where nobody is going there except themselves. I mean, working only Tigrayans in those industries. So this kind of ethnic killal system, ethnic killal system, is also a problem for economic progress. So, in my view, the real problem now in the country is where these parties are organized on ethnic lines. Unlike here in Switzerland, for example, parties are organized on ideology and interest basis, Socialist Party or Liberal, etc., etc. But in Ethiopia, it is a Tigray Party, Oromo Party, and Amara Party. This is the root cause, in my view, it's the root cause of, or the major problem of Ethiopia now. What's your take on that?
Thank you for coming, and thank you for inviting us here. The issue of as you know, there's a major debate in Ethiopian politics. The way I look at it, there is, of course, history why we have ethnic-based federalism. Issues could have been resolved during your generation in the 60s, but my generation inherited a lot of problems. And we have to find a way to get out of it. The problem is not necessarily just formation of federalism along ethnic lines. When you combine the ethnic federalism with democracy, you'll have a solution. Because federalism assumes there is going to be devolution of power and also democracy. What prevents movement of labor and capital across ethnic federalism is not necessarily because they are ethnicized, but because they are not allowed. If you look at the press release APRF released last week, it deplores, it condemns horizontal relationship, because federation is created, but power is still concentrated at the hand of the central power holders. And there is no negotiation between Oromia and Amhara. There is no negotiation. There is no any political social relationship between the two neighboring states, because the center power holder doesn't want it. If you take India, it's pretty much an ethnic federalism. A number of other countries. If you have democracy and if you have federalism together, you could actually find a way where the two states can find a solution. There could be negotiation between them. There could be, you can create even the issue of identity, for example. There's ethnic identity and country-wide identity. That identity can be created over time through markets, through force of market and others. But what you have in Ethiopia and what led to disintegration of other ethnic federalism says, you put ethnic federalism and you denied democracy, you are sitting in time bomb. So in Ethiopia, what we have right now is a situation where you have a federalism, but it's not allowed to function. Federalism is never allowed to function in Ethiopia. You have regional states, but power remain concentrated in the hand of the TPLF. But if you allow the parties, if you have democracy, and if you have democratic debate, we can have the kind of debate where me and you have it. But if we don't have it, people continue to grow apart. And that, I think, is the problem. And the solution is to democratize it and open the marketplace so that people can actually interact and find what is best for them, instead of one or two guys on top deciding.
The issue that federalism is or ethnic federalism is the cause. I've heard it so many times, but let's keep in mind, he said that don't bother that much about history, but it's the historical problem associated with the creation of the country of Ethiopia, that, as I said, in the last 60 years, since to the date, today's 2018, right? 1968, the problem was articulated as the question of nationalities. Federalism is a response to an existing problem. Federalism did not create the problem. It was actually a middle ground choice. Ethiopia has a problem of nation building, as I said, and that is based because we are a multinational country. We speak different languages, different religions. And federalism was a middle ground response, because on the one hand, because the state was facing this problem, on the one hand there is secessionism. That is, let's break it up. On the other hand, there is unitary state that says, forget about all of these problems, that it doesn't exist, simply denying that the problem doesn't exist and wishing it away. Federalism is a middle ground, sensible, rational solution that says we need to remain together rather than break down, but we cannot have a centralized unitary state. That was a problem. So it was a compromise. Federalism was a compromise solution. You only say that it is a problem if you really don't want to tackle the problem of nationalities. So it's not a problem. Second, the idea that federalism or ethnic federal units are not good for economic growth and flow of labor and capital, well, we have it now for 25 years, even longer. Even longer. That is, even under the Derg, there was some regional autonomy. So it hasn't happened. It hasn't happened. We don't have that problem. There is no problem of migration. There is no problem of flow of capital within the country. Humans are homo economicus. Where they find economic opportunities, they travel. The only problem in Ethiopia is that the Oromia region, is really where the resources are. And honestly speaking, Oromia is the microcosm of what Ethiopia should be, because all peoples from all backgrounds in Oromia live together, work together, and there is no problem of migration or movement of capital and human labor. The third, if this is a problem, if federal ethnic federalism is a problem, well, let's prioritize. We have a bigger problem right now, and then we will revisit. If it is a problem, we will revisit it in due course. Right now, what we need is a peaceful transition to a participatory democracy, a multi-ethnic, multilinguistic, multinational, ethnic, democratic constitutional state. If federalism is a problem, in due time we'll talk about it later on. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks. Alors, André, et puis après monsieur. Appuyez sur le bouton.
Alors, j'ai pas de bouton.
Ben, il faut venir devant, sinon on ne peut pas
So
enregistrer.
maybe I'll just sit here.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll sit next to you. And I'll push the button. We were talking about education, and you were saying that now there are maybe 30 universities. I understand that they are certainly not internationally recognized and so on. But the key question is, has the general level of education, has it increased in the last 20, 30 years, or has it stayed as it was before? So has it been an improvement or not? The second question is basically, you talked about it, talking about federalism, but is the government avoiding to pass to a more democratic or federal state because it perceives that there is a risk of dismantling the country if you do that? So that's basically the two questions I have.
With regard to education, I think yeah, the number of graduates from universities has increased, and that's what you're a higher education rather than education in general. We talked about higher education, university level education. The number of graduates has increased not just because there are state-owned universities whose number has increased, but there are also private universities. So in direct answer to your question, the number of degree holders, certificate holders has grown. The problem is almost 150,000 graduates in the Oromia region, after obtaining a master's degree, don't have jobs. What happens is that they get the degree, they get their degree, and then they go back to their villages to as the Prime Minister told them, mine gold in a very traditional way. I have seen myself a DVM, a doctor of veterinary medicine, who is working in a bar. There is no jobs. That's the thing, that there is no connection between graduation and success. Second thing is it's the quality of education. If a university doesn't have university professors, doesn't have books, doesn't have laboratories, why do you need them? Then the reason that the government needs them is it's to meet targets. This is a developmental state. They plan and they say, we need to meet those targets. So counting the number of graduates is a goal. The developmental state says we have increased the number of graduates. The quality, or whether they get jobs after education, doesn't matter. But in Ethiopia, those of you who are from Ethiopia know that education is the avenue for upward mobility, for success in life. It doesn't translate that way. And we have seen in Ethiopia protest over that question, that university students are saying, why are we even attending classes since when we get out of here, there are no jobs? And there are other problems with that you have to have a party identity to get jobs and all that. And the private sector is really small. The second question you have to ask about is the government avoiding...
Is the government avoiding federalism because there is a risk that the country will, disappear, or some region may make secessions?
I'll be brief on that one. Studies have shown that the government that is in power is, at the core of it, is the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, which represent about 6% of the country's population. But they won a war with the help of others. They won a war against the military dictator in 1991. So when they came in, as I was saying earlier, because it was an era of democratization, they had to speak the language of democracy. But in fact, they were never committed to the idea of real democratization, because when you have arranged politics along ethnic lines, people would function as in terms of identity politics, that they would vote only for the people that speak their language. That doesn't work well for a group that had captured power through a guerrilla warfare that the democracy is not in their benefit. It's not to their benefit. Democracy does not benefit them. So there is no way, and this has happened all over the world, where you have a minority in government, democracy doesn't work. I think that's why they're avoiding it.
I think on the education, it's not just higher education. The education in general, enrollment has significantly increased. The number of elementary schools have significantly increased. In the district I was born, there was 2 or 3, probably 2 elementary schools before this government came. Probably today 50 and plus. Yes, the number of kids who are going to school has significantly increased. The problem is the quality has deteriorated beyond imagination. There was a research done by USAID. It showed kids grade 3 and second grade and third grade, when they gave them math exam, only 10% of them could respond on average level. In reading as well, only 10% of them can pass the medium, the middle standard set internationally. Because they wanted to show to themselves and also to their outside backers that they are producing numbers. The reason, and when you go to tertiary education, so kids who are receiving really bad, one teacher teaches 100 students. So the ratio of student to teacher is very, very low, very, very high. And one book is shared by many students. So that has led to deteriorating education quality. When they get to tertiary level, they push them through. So when they graduate with a degree, but not with the knowledge. You have a low degree graduate, who can't write me a letter saying, how are you, my brother? In his own native language. Not in English, not in French, not in any other, not in a second language. They can't. They are not competent. They introduced something called 70-30. 70% of students have to graduate from science, and 30% from social sciences. So you have engineers and you have all kinds of people. They come out on the market, they are not employable because they don't have the skills that they need. And I think, earlier he was asking me about this image. So the numbers they pump into World Bank and IMF and the Americans and the Europeans, they are beautiful. But the real, you have somebody who graduates with a veterinary degree, but he can't take care of the dog. That's the problem you have.
Okay. Thanks. Oui, monsieur, puis après...
Thanks to the organizers and the panelists for your presentation and analysis and some of the proposals you've made, which I agree with. My question, especially, you've talked a lot about the need for a national dialogue, both within the party and also with the opposition. And you know that even the ruling party, the EPRDF, is a coalition of only 4 major parties, and Ethiopia is a country of more than 80 ethnic groups. Myself, I'm from one of those ethnic groups in southwest part of the country called Gambela. And the 4 regions, EPRDF is a coalition of 4 major parties, but from Gambela there is a party, and Asosa, Afar, and Somali. Those regions are not even part of the EPRDF, and how do you have a dialogue, a national dialogue within the party when the party itself is actually discriminatory of other ethnic groups? It's not inclusive of all the ethnic groups of Ethiopia. So I think in that respect we might need to have a broader and all-inclusive discussions if we really need to have a democratic Ethiopia where every Ethiopian is treated equally. On the question of federalism, I think you've already said a lot on that, which I also agree with. I think that the problem might not necessarily be the introduction of federalism as such, but even with its introduction for the last 25 years, we know that there has not been a genuine implementation of the constitution itself. What the party produced as the constitution. Instead, we've seen a very centralized system of governance than the implementation of a federal system. And last, on the issue of, again, related to dialogue, you've mentioned, Professor Ezekiel, about some of the major restrictive laws introduced over the last 10 years, the civil society law, the terrorism law, and in situations where there is no open civil society space, how would you, again, back to the issue of dialogue, how could you have dialogue in a situation where there is actually no space at all, whether politically or among civil society? Thank you.
That's an important question you raised. I see it in two ways. In the current configuration, you can add all the parties into EPRDF. It doesn't make any difference, because EPRDF itself is not actually a true coalition of a willing. It's a coalition of four dominated by one. So if you add the Gambella party, the Somali party, the Afar party, as long as the EPRDF is not a coalition of the willing that negotiates among itself and on a democratic basis, adding them is not going to change. So what's needed is actually democratize the whole coalition process, including the right to exit. Right now, OPDO has a totally different policy from TPLF, but it cannot air that position. It has to air what's decided by the TPLF. So adding the parties from other regions could probably create the nominal representation, but it doesn't make much of the change. But let that itself be discussed and debated. Right? Why is it locked? The ability for parties to enter into this coalition and leave has to be respected. I mean, coalitions are created to govern, not to live forever. The other big problem I see is there is a confusion between what party is and what government is. There is supremacy of a party over a government. EPRDF, or I don't know what the ruling party in this country is, can initiate a policy as a ruling party. But those policies have to be put into law by the government, by the three branches of the government. The executive, the legislative, the judiciary has to function. The parliament, decisions are made by these 36 people, or pretty much by 9 people from the TPLF, and the 547 people's representative are just there to vote on it. If you allow the parliament, both the parliament and the House of Federation, to debate, negotiate openly without accepting the rule by the party, then you would have a Gambella have a say in the federal government. Right now, let alone a Gambella, Oromia that has the largest representation in the parliament, has no say whatsoever. And an MP who represents my district is doing nothing for that district because his voice is not there. The decision is made at the top level. So when I say dialogue within it, one, the coalition party itself needs to start negotiating, because it is going to break apart if it doesn't negotiate. Because you have a group that is reformist, there is a group that want to continue the dominant form. Adding could be one on the table, but adding without democratizing the party system is not really is not going to solve the problem. You raised about how the federal system was never implemented. Yeah, it was never implemented because you have a government in Gambella, but we know who rules. The guy, the security attaché who sits there, rules over the region. And that cannot work in a federal system. In a federal system, there has to be democracy where there is checks and balances, where the regions exercise autonomy, but also still governed by the federal system. So democratizing the whole, allowing the government is not, there is no government in Ethiopia, there is parties that rules the country. So as long as that is in play, adding by itself might not be a solution.
Okay.
I think for Ethiopia today, the overarching problem should be transition, peaceful transition. In that respect, the party itself could play a very significant role in making sure that this transition, which will happen, whether the government likes it or not, it's going to happen. It's actually in process, is peaceful, that we have a peaceful transition. So when one proposes that there should be an intra-party dialogue, I think it's not between the components, that is the four parties. It's between the reformists and the diehard conservatives who want to remain clinging to power. I think that's the dialogue, that rather than the reformists like the people that you just talked about, being forced out of the party, that the party could simply see the writing on the wall. Change is going to happen. Transition is going to happen. That they have a stake in making sure that this transition is peaceful. So it begins within the party. The reason that it should begin within the party is, or where it should begin with the party is, in the executive committee. The executive committee, where they have 9, each of these 4 members have 9 representatives. It's internally undemocratic. And one of the surprising things about the announcement last year, the press release, is to say the party admitted that it's internally undemocratic, and said that that undemocratic nature had spilled over into the entire society and created a problem of democratic deficit. So it is good to begin where the problem originated. So in that sense, this reformists should be given more voice, should be given more representation within the party, and then the outside problem might also be affected by it. When you say something about the Gambela, by the way, when I used to go to Gambela, my father is from Dambidolo, I learned to say Dirijono. So, thank you. Markakis talks about the problem of marginalization on 2 levels. That is, the highland periphery is politically unintegrated. The lowland periphery is not only politically unintegrated, that is, they don't take part politically, they are also economically and culturally unintegrated. So there are 2 levels there. So I hear you when you say that how can the Amara and the Oromo could speak, the highland periphery could be about marginalization, but if they are not represented, what difference does it make if we have a dialogue of the unrepresented? In that sense, one of the things that we should just say is that instead of the dialogue being restricted to the party itself, let it go to the parliament, where there are people's representative. Is it acceptable to anyone in the world that the parliament, which is supposed to be the house of people representative, has not talked about the protest in public for the last 3 years? That the parliament did not talk about the protests. And the party doesn't know the difference. You know, the party itself doesn't know when it has violated that separation between party and government. It's not the role of the party to release prisoners, is it? The party doesn't have prisons. The party doesn't have its private political prisoners. It's the government. But who actually announced the release of political prisoners? Is it the government? It was the party. And the party doesn't know when it violates that separation between the formal structure of government and the ruling party. And that's a problem. So that's the reason that the issue should not be, the debate or the dialogue should not be restricted to within the party. It should go into the realm of formal government structures where people's representatives are debating intractable issues of the country in view of the people of the country itself. Not in this closed doors debate within the party, but in public. So the country's representatives must debate it, not the party itself. That's my idea.
Thank you. Thank you. Maybe last questions from... yeah.
So I'll make this too. My name is Adam Koniszewski from the Geneva Center for Security Policy, and I thank you very much for your contribution to helping us understand what is really happening in Ethiopia. I think what Guy said earlier, we always get this very rosy image of what's happening in terms of economic growth and this almost miracle that is happening in Ethiopia, and I think many people had their doubts that this was not the only story. So my 2 questions, and you can treat them separately or together. You mentioned the role of powerful allies, Bill Gates. I'm not sure if you mentioned the Clinton Foundation. You mentioned Obama. Could you more precisely explain what you meant by this, and if you meant that this was an intentional, with the intentional objective of maintaining a certain stability in the country for the welfare of the Ethiopian people, or if it's to maintain the stability of the regime. I'm not clear on what you meant. And the second question is, since you're here in Geneva, what is your expectation from the international community, which I think Geneva represents very well?
Thank you. The issue of this powerful allies, of course, the Clinton Foundation, Bill Gates, professors, people like Joseph Stiglitz and others, played very, very important role in creating this false image of stable and prosperous Ethiopia. But let's separate it into two, at the government level and at non-governmental level, be it as private citizens or as organizations. For the government, for the American government, for the British government, their interest over Ethiopia is very simple, a security interest. And whether it's democratic or not is secondary. This is, I mean, they might talk, they might talk politics and they might make it rousy, but the truth is they only care about Ethiopia playing a stabilizing role in the region, sending Ethiopian army to Somalia or to South Sudan and so on and so on. In order to achieve that, they have to, the Ethiopian government actually had a lot of leverage over them. If they push them towards democracy, they say, you know what, I'm pulling out my soldiers from South Sudan, I'm pulling out from Somalia. So they have to turn a blind eye not to compromise their key interest, security, as a government level. But more than the government, really, in terms of image building, the Stiglitz, the Clintons, the Jeffrey Sachs, they played big role. Why? They have a theory about how a developmental state, how they can replicate the success of the tigers, Asian tigers, in Africa. And they wanted to see having somebody who actually understands, spoke their language of developmentalism, people like Mallas. They desperately wanted to see a model in Africa. And they pushed, and they felt that the push from this liberal democratizing force jeopardizes the economic growth. And that's why they, I mean, I don't think anybody promoted Mallas more than Bill Gates and the Stiglitz. They really promoted. Bill Gates, yeah, he is doing a lot of humanitarian work in Ethiopia. I mean, he openly calls Ethiopia China of Africa. He wanted to believe on his wishes. I don't think it was a negative intent. I think it was a positive intent. He desperately wanted to see success so that his projects can succeed and he can showcase that outside. Overall, the two forces working together actually harmed. Because if you don't solve your political problem, you can have the fastest economic growth, you still will have a problem. Let's take Cote d'Ivoire, right? In the 80s, it was one of the fastest economy. And the Prime Minister of Malaysia wanted his country to be like that. Because that country for 30 years, it was growing above 7%. It was doubling every 10 years. It was so beautiful. But the internal political contradiction was not solved. The ethnic tension exploded. And that country right now is one of the poorest in Africa. So you could have an Ethiopia that grows at multiple digits. But if it doesn't solve the contradiction, particularly if the fruits of that development, that economic growth, are not dispersed equally, if there is a sense of being discriminated against, if the system favors certain ethnic groups over the rest, sooner or later it is going to explode. When it explodes, it destroys all those gains. So it is very important to push that. What do you expect from international community? I'm a little bit pessimistic. I believe in spending 90% of my resources on the people on the ground, 10% on diplomacy. I think right now there is an opportunity. The rise of this powerful nonviolent movement that turn away from violence, the innovative way of weakening the government without resorting into civil war, is an opportunity that will lead to a result that's good for Ethiopians and good for international community. Good for Ethiopians because it will lead to stability and democracy, it will bring in freedom. As a good for international community, meaning America, that a stable democratic Ethiopia is a guarantor of peace and security in the region. So for that reason, they need to support the reformists within the government, and they have to make it clear to the government that any attempt to crack down on reformists will not be accepted. They have to side, even if they don't go on a record and openly support the protest. They need to strengthen the reformists. They need to pressure the hardliners. Because the Ethiopian security is an ally of the Western. And pressuring the generals, pressuring the chief of securities will enable, will empower reformists within the system as well as those who seek from outside.
Thanks.
I think by powerful allies, it's really basically the government of the United States. All of these were important because it's a powerful military, but it also has influence, diplomatic influence everywhere. That its influence is felt by Canada, by England, by everywhere. The overriding presence, the reason for United States being an ally of the United States is to fight what they call the war against terror. I think the United States would be best served if it has a stable country within Ethiopia, because democracies fight less. Look, there was, as I was saying, there were 3 years of protest through a state of emergency. No one said anything about it. Maybe the New York Times and other outlets have started to recognize because of the longevity of the protests. But when students started protesting in Iran, the United States was ready to jump on it and highlight that there are protesters in Iran. So that we have known. So we're pessimistic that they would help. We don't need their help. What we need is actually their hands off. Just stay hands off. Stay out of it. For your own sake. For your own sake. What you want is a reliable partner, right? A reliable partner is not an authoritarian dictatorship. A reliable partner is people who share your values in equality, liberty, in human dignity, and human rights. That's what we're trying to, the people of Ethiopia want. And in that case, you would find a more reliable ally in Ethiopia than the dictator that is in its last days, in my own judgment. In the expectation. The only thing that I would say is that when thousands of people were killed by their own government using its military that was supposed to defend the country. This is not the police, it's the military, the country's military, Ethiopian Defense Forces, that are killing with impunity in all regions of the country. There is a human tragedy in Ethiopia. 700 to 1 million people, Oromos, displaced from the Somali region and dumped in Oromia. They are there. 700,000 people are displaced. It's not a joke. This is a reality. Nothing was said about it. Geneva needs to know this. So that's what I say. Pay attention. Geneva is the seat for internally displaced people. Look, 700 to 1 million people displaced in their own country. It should be a story globally, but it also should be a concern for humanitarian organizations in Geneva or elsewhere. Generating refugees that are trekking outside the country in all directions and taking to deserts through the Sahara and through the treacherous waters of the Mediterranean, all the way to Europe, knocking on the doors of European governments, and call them economic refugees. I mean, going to Yemen and dying on the seas, going to South Africa and trying to leave this place that has become hell for them. This is what's happening in the country. People are here. Listen to them. Listen to their stories here. Because who wants to leave a country that is economically miraculous? You would want to stay there. Even to the United States. In the last 5 years, the net migration of Mexicans was negative. That more Mexicans are going back to Mexico than those coming to the United States. But they want to build a wall. Look, here in America, in Europe, people in Switzerland, France, from the Horn of Africa, they are not really looking for opportunities. There are many of them here. They just could not continue to exist. Otherwise, you wouldn't take it through Libya. You wouldn't take it to the Mediterranean crossing or to the Indian Ocean. So while all of this is happening, the international organizations in Geneva or elsewhere are not paying attention. At least just for example, that is important. These two issues are important, that there are 1 million internally displaced people in Ethiopia. And there are millions more that have left the country knocking at the doors of Europe. That should be that should be a wake-up call for Europe. It is the situation in the country. Help it change if you really want it resolved, the migration problem itself.
I want to add just one point on the issue of refugees. One of the weird things Europe is doing is, of course, they are concerned. This largely young men refugees are coming in thousands to Europe, to Germany, to Switzerland, elsewhere. So they want to stop it. Guess how they want to stop it? By giving more money to a repressive government in Ethiopia. I think in the amount of 500 million over the next few years. Guess what that money is doing? It is enabling the government to increase repression on people. You are actually paying, Europeans are paying to bring more refugees here. So I think, those of you in human rights and others in Geneva need to pay attention to what the governments in Europe are doing. They want to stop refugees. Who is kicking the refugees from their country? The government. Who do you give money to? The government. What did the government do with it? Buy bullets with it, shoot on people. So you are going to have more refugees. So the European intervention, the Americans mostly in political security, the European intervention in the name of development, particularly in the name of refugees, I think that the Khartoum Accord, even in Libya, in Ethiopia, it's creating more refugee crisis than solve it. So Geneva could have some role in this.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for your speech, for your presentation, your answers. I think we have a lot of views on internet, 5,000, so it's quite a lot. So, yeah, good conference. So, wish you all the best for the future, and thank you very much.
Thank you.